Hey, what's up, everybody? Mr. On Demand back again. Thought I'd come in with a little bit of a different topic tonight. Thought I'd do a little live show about Linux. There's a lot of reasons why it's one of the best operating systems out there and why it's also not the best operating system. Um, a lot of good and bad, both about Linux, and I think what you get is you get a lot of fans of it that will point to the good parts, and rightfully so. um and then you get a lot of normal users that are like, should I switch to Linux? Should I switch or should I not switch? And that's the question, like, should you? The average for most people, I mean, the answer for most people is no. um but I'm going to talk about why. We'll see if anybody comes up with some different opinions on this. I just thought to do a little bit of a different live show. I was curious, like, okay, you know what? Today, the top games, right? Um, Top games running. You got here. This is gaming on Linux. This was it says January 2022 edition. There was roughly about half of the top 10 games in a 24-hour peak that were broken by anti-cheat. I believe that's better, but I think it's still in the 30 something to 40% area most of the time that you got the top 10 games, not working, and you're always going to have some of those top games. I mean, even if it's only 20%, and according to some of the other articles I saw, and I'm not just going to talk about games, this is just one in the vast number of things about Linux that is crazy. I mean, they've done a lot to fix issues with Linux and with gaming, um, and the Steam Deck and the Steam with Proton is one of the biggest things that has uh, done that and helped, and that propelled Linux in a whole new way in the world of gaming. They still have a large percentage of games, and we're just talking about the top 10 to the top 100. You're looking at a good 20% of games roughly that don't work, up to as much as 30 or 40% if we're talking about maybe just the top 10 games. And that's a pretty big amount. So, like, if I take 100 games, if I have a library of the top 100 games in Steam, um, there's going to be about 20 of them I won't be able to play. And so that's, that can be an issue. It depends on what games you like to play and everything, but that games is just one aspect of the whole situation. Some of the positives about Linux, it's actually, let's see, it's like the number one OS for servers, developers. 47% of professional developers use Linux. Uh, Linux's market size worldwide is huge because most people don't realize that the Android OS runs on its base of Linux. Linux also is one of the top web servers for hosting websites. 96.3% of the top 1 million web servers are running Linux. So Linux is definitely best, and I've always said this, it's really great as a server. If you want to have a server, Linux actually is a very stable, does a very good job. One of the downsides to Linux is there's a lot of different Linux distros. Linux is not easy to configure and set up. Depending on the distro you use, it's going to be completely different from distro to distro because they have different GUIs and they have different setups involved in that. So this is one of the reasons why a lot of people, I've heard for 30, 20 something years, Linux is going to be the next big thing. Linux is the next big thing. It's going to take over Windows. That's always a funny thing because they've done nothing but move a couple of percentage points in the right direction. they're still only like 4 to 6% of the market when it comes to PCs and when it comes to home users. Now, this is the thing. When I said developers and servers, that Linux is the best option for that. Yeah, it's not the best option for the end user, though, in my opinion. The end user, at the end of the day, needs something that's a little stronger, a little better, that does the job for their normal software they want to use. And when I say normal software, I'm talking about things like Microsoft Office. I'm talking about things like Adobe software, editing and photo software. There's a lot of things. And then there's driver support. So when you go down to the store and you try to purchase a product, let's just say you're purchasing a new printer or a new webcam or whatever it might be, you're going to have to make sure that that product has Linux support as well. So if it doesn't have Linux support, then it's not going to work. You can pretty much rest assured any of those products are going to have Windows support. That's the difference. Just about everything you buy is going to be supported in Windows for the end user. So if you want to play as an end user, if you want to play games and you want to play them, without any flaws and any problems, for the most part, Windows is going to be your better choice. If you're going to want to use software like Adobe and Microsoft Office, those are just a couple of examples. There's actually a lot of software out there. And then your Linux users will throw out ways around that. Well, there's no ways around it. The ways around it they're talking about is using some emulation that causes that software to run slower, but then that software a lot of times doesn't even run correctly. So we're talking about whine. Now, that's one thing. The other better option is to actually run the native software in Linux that's made to do the things that software that you no longer have anymore, that doesn't run natively anymore, can do in Linux, and you run the native software. So that's your better option, but then you're looking at having to figure out how to use your computer in a whole different way. You have to do that anyway with Linux, because Linux is a very different OS when it comes to getting programs installed and everything. And when I was talking about hardware support too, I was also talking about like video cards. NVIDIA video cards notoriously have terrible driver support in Linux. You're going to get worse performance in Linux, and sometimes it's not going to run at all on certain things. So that's an issue. So you got to make sure when you're building a Linux computer, if you're building a machine and you're planning on running Linux, you better look at all the hardware and make sure you're getting everything to be compatible with Linux at the end of the day. It's just a few of the things. I like Linux, don't get me wrong. I'm just think people should look at all of the things, everything, and decide for themselves what's best for them. I think an end user at the end of the day, what's best is to run a Windows-based operating system. I'm not even getting into the Mac OS because it's absolutely horrible at playing games. So if you're a regular end user at home and you want to play games, you're going to want to run Windows, or you're going to run Mac, and then you're going to run a variety of a whole bunch of other consoles. And I'm not a fan of having a whole bunch of different devices. I would rather just have one device. So, that's just my looking at things. And at the end of the day, Linux is a great operating system. Like I said in the title, it's the best and the worst both. And it's the worst operating system for an end user, a home user. And the percentages show that when you look at when you look at the games and the business software, when it comes to Microsoft Office and Adobe and the support you get for that, you're not getting as much ability in that area. So you get stuck with having to figure out other options. And then that becomes a whole lot of learning and a whole lot of work to figure those other options out. Whether or not you want to do that or not, that's, really up to you. Um, let's talk about some of the you know, some of the good things about Linux. Let's see. So this is fairly recent right here, and this was some good information. So, statistics: 47% of professional developers use Linux-based operating systems. Linux powers 39.2% of websites whose operating system is known. Linux powers 85% of smartphones. So the base under Core OS, what they're talking about, the kernel in there is a Linux kernel running underneath the OS that is actually on the phone, because we all know iOS and Android is mostly what's running the smartphones out there. What they did was they designed their own custom distro. They're roughly, but it's not really a distro of Linux. It's really different than that. So this is a little bit misleading right here. Linux, the third most popular desktop OS. It is. It said it has a market share of 2.06%. I think that share is up to closer to 3%. I want to say, but I'm not 100% sure on that. The Linux market size worldwide will reach 15.64 billion by 2027. That's a projection. We're in 2025. A lot can happen in a couple of years. The world's top 500 fastest supercomputers all run Linux. So that's, something very interesting. 96.3% of the top 1 million web servers are running Linux. Today, there are over 600 active Linux distros. That's not a good thing, in my opinion. How many distros of Windows are there? Not really a bunch of distros, right? So people want stability, they want standardization, they don't want a lot of change. And this is what's caused a lot of issues for some of the new versions of Windows, when Microsoft has decided to flat out change those things. Let's see. That's been an issue for Microsoft. 47% of professional developers use Linux-based operating systems. So, and developers, I can see it, because you got to understand, Linux is better as a server. It does virtual machines. You can run things in a virtual environment. There's a lot of things Linux can do that's good for developing. But let's face it, most of us are not developers. We're not making apps. We're just running apps on our machine, and that's what we want to run them, and we want to be able to run them well. Linux powers nearly 40% of websites whose operating system is known. So, some overall lists here about Linux. I'm considering changing my own server over to Linux in the future. I'm actually running Windows as my home-based NAS server, but I'm thinking of I'm considering moving to that, and that might be something that would give me a little more performance and a little more, make my network or my server run a little better. That's a big question mark right now. It's running fine, so it's like, if it isn't broke, don't fix it type thing, and I'm getting plenty of performance out of it. About 90% of Hollywood special effects rely on Linux. Now, this is not really true. I read this earlier and I was like, 90%? I don't think so. If you ever wonder how breathtaking special effects are created, they're mostly made in Linux. Approximately 90% of visual effects in Hollywood rely on Linux at some stage of the production. That's the key right there, some stage. Now, some of the top software is the Adobe After Effects and Adobe Premiere for editing and et cetera, that even studios are using. And a lot of video software is not really running through Linux. You could probably say a similar thing about Windows, because they're not just, the movies go through a process. They use a lot of different equipment and machines. Some of the machines will be running Linux to run a specific program to do a specific thing. The base editing can be being done on something else. They could be using a Mac for editing as well. So there's a lot of different machines depending on the effect and what they want to get out of the video. So this is kind of a misleading statistic, in my opinion. Something they put on here just to try to boost the stats for Linux. I'm trying to be unbiased as much as possible on this, because this is a biasly written thing, in my opinion. 85% of smartphones are Linux powered. To be precise, 85% of smartphones are Android based, which originated from the Linux kernel. So they're being honest there. Android isn't Linux. It doesn't run Linux programs. It's just runs the Linux kernel. It's its own OS, really. Today, Android has significant dominance in the market since the launch of Android 11. The platform has lived off of Linux kernel long-term support. Linux user statistics confirm. So, just because it's running off the Linux kernel doesn't mean it's actually running Linux per se. So, 100%. And a good example of this is you can't just load Linux on Android phones. So if you want, let's just say, I want to change my distro. I want a different copy of Linux. You can't do it, because they load, the way they load, and I talked about this in a previous video, is Linux a good operating system? And I talked about the fact that Linux uses, because it's on predominantly, not Linux, but Android uses ARM-based processors, and all those systems use what's called a firmware install instead of actually installing software on a drive. So it's a very, very different way of installing things that gives you like no flexibility at all. So all these machines that they're talking about that are running Linux, that are actually running Android, they cannot run any Linux programs on these machines because they're not actually running Linux. So there's an issue there with the whole statement of the smartphone industry. While it's using the Linux kernel, it's not really running Linux, and you cannot wipe it out and load a pristine copy of Linux. There are a few phones that you can. Those are few and far between, and not very many at all. Very, very, very few can actually support like a fully running Linux. And then when you do actually go through all of the work and trouble, which it's a pain in the butt to actually load Linux on one of the phones that will support it, a lot of things are broken. A lot of stuff doesn't work right. So yeah. For 0.44%. Now I don't know if this was a typo. They meant 44%. Because the Steam Deck is Linux. The Steam Deck actually is its own distro of Linux. You can actually fully run Linux on it. It is an x86 type of device, not an ARM-based, running on a firmware install of an OS. So this is a completely different scenario, and I think this was a typo. I think they meant to say 44%, not 0.44%. That's not even half of a percent. So that's not that I don't think that's right. But I think the Steam Deck was one of the biggest leaps forward to make Linux a more mainstream operating system. And I think that probably brought more Linux users into using actual Linux than anything that has happened in Linux for like the last 20 years. I think Steam themselves is like with Proton with their game software has been the biggest leap forward. Intel and Huawei technologies rank. Let's see. Mozilla VPN allows users to set Linux-based computer locations to over 30 countries. I'm not going to get into VPNs. That's a whole separate video. Intel and Huawei technologies rank as the two biggest contributors to the Linux kernel. Yeah, I mean, I would say that that's probably correct. Intel's in really bad shape, and Huawei's kind of been banned from the United States. So that is what it is. Linux market share statistics. Linux is in the third most popular desktop OS with 2.09% market share. In 2019, Linux accounted for 13.6% of servers globally. Even a cursory glance into Linux versus Windows Server market share comparison would show that the latter has the lead, but they score similar growth rates. Between 2018 and 2019, Windows grew from 71.9 to 72.1%, while Linux servers reached 13.6%, up from 12.9%. The whole server thing is a whole different thing. No, I don't use Linux right now, Guns. I have used Linux in the past, several different distros, and I don't feel Linux is right for the average home user. The average home user, I think, is better off with Windows. But Linux is definitely better suited in the server market. I could see myself switching my home server, my NAS, over from Windows to Linux in the future, and that's a very good possibility of that happening at some point. The whole point of this video was kind of to be non-biased, to come on and talk about Linux and talk about the different ways that Linux is good and bad. So, for instance, in the gaming side of things, Linux is not nearly as good as Windows because it doesn't run as many games. A lot of games are broken because of anti-cheat not working. And that's across the board, whether you're talking about the top games on Steam or whether you're talking about Windows games in general. But Steam has really helped Linux become much more prevalent in the gaming world when it comes to that. And I think all of that is a big deal. So as of 2017, 90% of cloud infrastructure operates on Linux. 96.3% of the top 1 million web servers are running Linux. And the most popular Linux distro. So there's, let's see, some of the most commonly used is Debian, Gentoo, Ubuntu. So I haven't used these. Debian I've looked at a lot. I've used Ubuntu. I've used Red Hat. And I've used Red Hat for many servers, to be honest, that I've worked with. And I have used Arch Linux, and that's about it. So I've been using my Linux on my low-end Chromebook, and I got all my APKs without installing an emulator. Cool. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the big things that Linux can do for people is you can take lower end devices or older laptops that aren't supporting newer Windows anymore, and you can still make a very usable device. So unlike some of the people out there that are going to come on and they're just going to be like, oh no, Linux is the best, I'm a Linux fanboy. No, I'm going to be like, yeah, Linux is really good, and it's good for this and this and this. I'm going to be a realist about it. And then I'm going to be like, yeah, and then Windows is good for this and this and this. Android is good for this and this and this. And so you got to take, and you can't really take and be saying that it's a one size fits all, that you can just use one OS for everything. And there, I personally think Windows is the best operating system for the average user, or even if for the average home user who just wants to set up a home server, mainly because of all the tutorials that are out there on how to set everything up. It's easier to set up. You're going to have it up and running much quicker, and it's got plenty of support for different hardware and different machines, so that you're going to be able to do all sorts of things. That being said, in a corporate business environment where you're making a machine that's specifically designed to do like one server thing, Linux can be a much better option because it's not bloated down with a lot of extra garbage that you just don't need. You can also have a custom distro Linux that doesn't have anything extra installed on it. At the end of the day, though, when you're an end user at home, there is the issues with Microsoft Office and Adobe. You're not getting full compatibility, even if you run Wine or you run other types of things to make it compatible. And that's the key. And while you can run your APKs just fine on Linux, and you can do a lot of things like that, on the Android side of it, you can't run a lot of those nice Linux things on Android the same way you can do it on Linux, because you're not really running a full copy of Linux. You're running a very specialized version of Linux for Android that is just running a Linux kernel, and the rest of it is much, much different. And so some of the statistics that were shown, that I showed a little bit ago, might have been a little bit off because of what they were talking about in the phone market as well. But Linux definitely, I mean, people should always consider a form of Linux for certain jobs. Hey, how's it going, Philly? Thought I'd come on and talk about something different today, and get out of the streaming thing and talk about computers and talk about Linux and Windows and etc. And I think if we're techies, running a Linux machine or two along with our Windows machines, because they all have their strengths, right? They all run certain things. They'll all run a certain program that the other won't properly or better or whatever. So, there's a lot of things there. Or if you want to set up a server, I mean, if you really want to get the most performance and you really want a really, really, really good server, Linux is definitely going to give you probably the better reliability and the better, better performance than Windows will in that area. That being said, compatibility wise, as far as what server software you're wanting to run and what kind of server you're setting up. Are you setting up a Plex? Are you setting up just an HTTP web server? Are you setting up some other special server to serve your webcams that maybe they don't have Linux software for that, and so you're better off with that server running Windows because of that. There's 100 different things that you could set up a server for, whether it's security, whether it's your games, a game server for you to remotely log in and play games on it, or whether it's just a file server and a NAS, or a web server, FTP server. So really at the end of the day, it depends on what kind of server are you making? Are you going to have multiple servers? Maybe you have one server that does some of the things that you want to do and another server that does other things. Because, this OS will serve these things better than that OS, and that OS will serve these things better. So there could be a situation where you actually run multiple servers. So I hope everybody's doing good tonight. But I wanted to highlight some of these things that you know I thought about. The NVIDIA video card support in Linux is a big issue for me. If you're wanting to be an end user, then you've got driver and hardware support going forward as an end user. If you're going to buy new webcams, new headsets, new whatever you're going to buy, having proper support for that hardware, printers, etc. All can be an issue. Then you're going to run into the software support issue where you don't have the same kind of support in Linux that you do with a Windows device. There's going to be way more tutorials to help you figure out fixes to issues in Windows than in Linux. It's not me talking bad about Linux. It's a good operating system. I've stated that, but there is things to think about. The compatibility across the board with how many games it'll play is another issue. Have running wine is not a good solution for a lot of software, because even if the software opens, it tends to be more prone to other glitches and problems. So that becomes an issue to think about as well. But definitely there's, in the world today, we all need to consider what we're going to want to use a machine for. The software that we put into that machine is very important. That's why I am wholeheartedly against a lot of devices that are just really proprietary when it comes to the software. This is why I made a video a while back talking about, the best gaming device, and talking about x86, the x86 platform being a better platform because it's more versatile as far as being able to load whatever you want onto it. When you're looking at the ARM-based platform, it's mostly all firmware, and you have to have a different copy of the OS with all of the drivers already integrated into it, so there is no driver updating and support unless the person making the copy of the operating system does that for you. And that's not good, because when you're dealing with things like Linux or you're dealing with Windows, you actually can go ahead and update the driver whenever the company makes an update for the driver. That's just not the case on the other end. This is one of the big issues I have with when I'm seeing what's coming out with with these new ARM-based laptops and ARM-based Windows, because it's not the same kind of ability to update drivers as it is with a regular x86 Windows machine. And a lot of people don't realize the differences. So this is something that's new in the market. I mean, it's only been over the last year that we started having some of these X Elite laptops start hit the market. And many people get them and they're just thinking, oh, longer battery life. It's running Windows. It'll run my software. But they don't realize that you're actually running Windows emulation to run all the x86 programs inside Windows on an ARM-based version of Windows. It's Microsoft's emulation that they built into it. And that's so that's always an issue as well. Getting a little off topic from Linux now, but that being said, those are things everybody should understand when they're picking what they're going to buy. This is why I've countless times told my clients, don't buy the X Elite right now. Don't buy the ARM-based Windows laptops. You're much better off just getting a good good i7, i5, or getting a good AMD based laptop. Depending on what you want what you want the laptop for, it's going to be more compatible with all the software that people are using, today, than the software compatibility that you have on those other machines, which is not good. They will get better though. They will get better. I do believe that that Qualcomm will get better with their ARM-based X Elite series of processors, and You've also got now we've got Nvidia going to be getting into that market as well, and you've also got some major stuff that's going to be coming out. AMD's coming out uh, um, with their new processor and built-in APU graphics. That's hitting with Strix Halo as well. So there's a lot coming onto the market right now. A lot coming onto the market that people should know about. And if you haven't looked into that yet, that's going to be huge. Strix Halo, along with what Nvidia is going to be coming out with whatever they put out onto the market. Although I wouldn't be surprised for their stuff to have some serious issues considering what's going on with the Nvidia graphics cards right now. So, and I did a video on that. You know that it's complete. The 5000 series is all of the 5000 series cards, in my opinion, complete disaster. Wouldn't recommend anybody buy any of them at all. Buy a 4000 series or buy one of the new AMD cards. Don't buy the 5000 series. Absolute disaster of a release of video card. That market share statement's misleading. Which one, Philly? Yeah, I believe you. Um, I believe you. There was a lot of market share statements in here. That was not sure which one maybe you're talking about, but I was definitely saying the same thing about some of the market share stuff in here. It's hard to judge the market share of Linux completely. And I said they were saying it was only like 2% for Linux at general for general people using it in PCs, and I think it's closer to 3 to 6%, not 2. And how many people use Linux? Yeah, I think you're probably right. I don't think 2% is correct on here. While they gave a larger market share in some areas where I don't think was correct, I don't think all the numbers are 100% correct. This was done in February of 2024 on this Linux statistics. Regardless of what the market share is as a whole, it's small. Linux is not a lot of people actually use Linux, like, and definitely don't use it as their daily driver. It's I don't use it as a daily driver, and while it's a great operating system, I think it's better suited to single uses, and I think it's better suited to servers. Personally, I don't think it's a great everyday OS. Unless you decide you're really going to sit down and take the time to learn it inside and out, because it's a complicated operating system to use. At it Some of the distros try to make it easy. They try to make it easy with a built-in like Play Store type thing where you can throw some software in there. Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do. I have a little mini PC running Linux right now. It's running Arch Linux right now, and that I installed for just some experimentation purposes. I've been doing this for 30 years, so I've installed all kinds of different distros of Linux over the years. The first distro I installed was Red Hat, and I've used multiple different versions of Red Hat uh, and for servers when I've done some of my enterprise server work for some clients. But uh, for your daily driver, no. Do I When I sit down to my computer, I want to know that I'm going to be able to run the software I want to run. And so if 20% of the games from Steam out of the top 100 don't work, that becomes a real issue if I'm wanting to sit down and play games. if I'm wanting to sit down and actually run, normal, a lot of normal everyday things, software like, the Adobe software I use or the Microsoft Office software I use, that becomes an issue. Now I realize there's substitutes for that you can run, but really there's not a substitute in a lot of ways for Adobe. And there's in some ways not a substitute. There actually isn't a substitute in some ways for Microsoft Office either. And you can't fully run those with Wine properly either. With the way things are being done now, it's not. They're not the compatibility isn't 100% out there. So it does become an issue. You can run other software to try to get the same job done, and that can work for you. And that's what I would recommend is you get something like Arch Linux, use the store that comes with it, use the software that's, native, and try to use that first before trying to use any kind of software for doing any kind of emulation on that. And you'll be in better shape. But again, I only use Linux for single purpose things that I want to maybe do with Linux, and I don't use it daily. So I'm not your I'm not a big Linux guy, because there's too many times over the 30 years that I've been doing IT that I've found Linux to have shortfalls and not do a certain thing that I daily want to do. And that's not just me. If it didn't have the shortfalls, it would have a lot more percentage of people using it for their daily use at home. And I'm not making up the compatibility issues with NVIDIA video cards. They run slower and they don't work well at all with Linux. That's a big problem for a lot of people if they want to run the best video cards and have the best support on the AI side of those video cards as well. So, there is that. And the percentage of games that don't play on it. Those two things alone are enough for me not to run Linux as a daily driver, because some of the things I do is play games. So that alone, causes an issue. But the fact that I'm not going to be able to run some of my other programs that don't have anything to do with games properly either, that also plays into the fact that I wouldn't recommend it as a daily driver for an end user at home. If you're a developer though, you know how to use virtual machines, and you want to use your containers, and if you're a Docker person and you like to use that stuff, that's a whole different scenario. That's a whole different scenario that people can get into. I am. But that's not I'm not using Windows as a primary operating system because it's a better operating system. The It's got better support. It's got better hardware support, it's got better software support. And let's be real. Why did Windows not win out when they tried to put out the Windows Phone? The reason they didn't win out when they tried to do the Windows Phone is because they didn't have the support for apps. So software and app support is a big deal. When you don't have the support to be able to run the software that you want to run, you're going to go to what actually works, because Linux doesn't work to run those programs. That's just a 100% thing. It has nothing to do with being a Linux fanboy or a Windows fanboy or otherwise. People are going to gravitate toward what works. So if the Windows Phone had the app support, then Microsoft would have won out or at least have a huge market share in the phone market right now compared to Android and iOS. But they didn't. Microsoft did some stupid things. They blocked the ability to run a lot of apps because they wanted to control the apps themselves, and then they didn't provide apps to the people on the devices that they wanted. So that was a big problem. Hopefully they've learned their lesson when it comes to that. But on the flip side of that, that's one of the big problems Linux has. Linux has a support issue because they don't have one main company. They have a ton of different distros from a ton of different companies that you have to rely on support from. And that becomes a real issue for people because there's no standardization. So when you jump into Linux, you got to be a little bit more of a techie guy. And how should I put it? If you run Linux, you love fiddling with the operating system instead of actually using it. I'm going to be real. If you really, really love Linux, you just love the operating system and love messing with it and making it work. Because at the end of the day, when you load up Windows, there's really kind of just basically one version of Windows. There's a couple of different types of versions, but they're all basically the same when you're running Windows 11. And you're going to load it up and they're the same across the board. You can load tools and things and tweak, the start menu, whatever you want to do. But people get the standardization from it and it just works. Whereas with Linux, it's not loaded up. Depending on the distro you load, it's not fully set up with everything. There's a lot of setup that you're going to have to do to make it work. Anyway, that's my opinion on it. I'll stick to it. Um, I still think Linux is a great operating system. I think it's got. I love the fact that we have an option like Linux in the marketplace for all of us to have something different to be able to make use of some other features out there. All right, guys. Well, I'm going to get off here. I just wanted to jump on and do something a little different than the same old stuff that I've been doing. And I want to thank you all for coming by and stopping by and watching my show. And I'll see you guys all in the next one. Hit a thumbs up before you leave, and I'll see you again soon.